The sound of my sister's hand striking my 10-month-old son's thigh did not sound like a television slap. It was a sharp, wet crack that echoed off the dining room walls, cutting through the smell of roasted turkey and sage stuffing. It was Thanksgiving evening, 8 minutes past 6. And that single echoing snap split our family history into two distinct eras. The decades I spent pretending we were normal, and the permanent, freezing reality that followed. Vanessa's phone was propped against a crystal water pitcher. The blinding white circle of her portable halo light illuminated the tension in her jaw. She had brought a lighting rig to our Thanksgiving table because she was contractually obligated to deliver a holiday authenticity stream to her 3 million followers. When Leo gasped, drawing in a ragged breath before releasing a terrified, high-pitched shriek, Vanessa did not gasp with him. She did not recoil. She did not cover her mouth in horror. She simply stared at her glowing screen, her manicured fingers hovering over the device. And Sahil, can someone get him out of here? She snapped, not looking at me. The audio is completely blown. I am trying to share a moment of gratitude with my community. I sat frozen in my own dining chair. The heat from Leo's tiny, trembling body seeped through my knitted sweater as I pulled him against my collarbone. I pressed my lips to his soft hair, feeling his pulse racing against my cheek. I looked across the table. My mother, Helen, was staring intently at her half-eaten sweet potatoes. She did not blink. She simply tightened her grip on her silver fork until her knuckles turned the color of old bone. My father, Arthur, and cleared his throat, picked up his linen napkin, and dabbed the corners of his mouth. He looked at the ceiling fixture. He looked at the window. He looked everywhere except at the spreading red welt on his grandson's exposed leg. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by Leo's rhythmic sobbing. Then Elias stood up. My husband had spent 8 years as a city paramedic before transferring to the fire department. He was a man who spent his professional life managing absolute chaos with a terrifying, clinical calm. He placed his napkin on the table. He did not slam it. He folded it neatly into a square. He walked around the perimeter of the table until he stood directly behind Vanessa's chair. He reached over her shoulder, grabbed the blinding halo light, and clicked it off. The sudden loss of illumination cast the room into a muted graidusk. Vanessa whipped her head around, her immaculate veneers bared in indignation. "Excuse me, I am live with 40,000 people." "Not anymore," Elias said. His voice was not loud. It was low, steady, and possessed the exact tonal quality of a concrete wall. "You need to leave our house right now." Vanessa blinked, her gaze darting to my parents, searching for the rescue parachute they had deployed for her every day of her 35 years. "Mom, are you going to let him talk to me like this?" The baby was ruining the broadcast. I barely touched him. "Maya is making him hysterical." My mother finally looked up. Her expression, a masterclass in aggressive neutrality. "Elias, please, Let us not ruin the holiday over a misunderstanding. Vanessa has been under an immense amount of pressure with her new skincare launch. Her anxiety is peaking. I stood up. My knees shook, trembling so violently I had to lean my hip against the mahogany table to keep myself upright. I looked at the woman who had carried me for 9 months, and I felt nothing but a cold, hollow vacuum in my chest. She hit my son. I said, my voice cracking on the final word. She swatted his leg. Maya, my father muttered, adjusting his glasses. Children need discipline. You are hovering too much. You always have. Elias did not engage with them. He kept his eyes locked on Vanessa. Coat, gaze, door. I will not ask you a second time. Vanessa stood slowly, grabbing her expensive leather tote and shoving her lighting equipment inside. She did not apologize. She did not look at Leo. She marched down the hallway, her heels striking the hardwood floor like hammer blows, and slammed the heavy front door behind her. My parents departed 10 minutes later, leaving their plates full. My mother paused in the foyer, adjusting her cashmere scarf, and looked at me with a profound, bitter disappointment. I hope you are satisfied. Maya, you have fractured this family over an infant's tantrum. When the house was finally empty, Elias locked the deadbolt. He checked the back doors. He closed the blinds. He walked into the kitchen, where I was sitting on the cold linoleum floor, rocking Leo until his cries faded into exhausted hiccups. Elias sat down beside us on the floor, his broad shoulders resting against the oven door, and wrapped his arms around both of us. It is over, he whispered against my forehead. We are never doing this again. I believed him, but I severely underestimated the machinery my family had built to protect my sister's reputation. Growing up in the shadow of Vanessa was like trying to grow flowers in a windowless basement. She demanded all the light, all the oxygen, all the attention. I learned very early that my survival depended on making myself as small and uncomplicated as possible. I became a special education teacher, finding my purpose in quiet, uncelebrated milestones. Vanessa moved to the city, monetized her appearance, and built an empire on the illusion of wellness, spiritual alignment, and toxic positivity. More importantly, she built an empire that funded my parents' reality. When my father was forced into early retirement, Vanessa swooped in. She paid the mortgage on their luxury waterfront condo. She funded their European river cruises. In exchange, they served as the loyal guardians of her false narrative. Whenever Vanessa was cruel, she was simply overwhelmed by the demands of success. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I was grading spelling tests at the kitchen island when my phone began vibrating continuously. Notifications poured in across every platform. Vanessa had uploaded a heavily edited 10-minute video titled "My Heartbreak Setting Boundaries with Toxic Family." She sat on a plush velvet sofa, wearing a perfectly oversized beige sweater, her face scrubbed clean of makeup to project raw vulnerability. She stared into the lens and let a single agonizing tear track down her cheek. I never thought I would have to make this video. Her recorded voice echoed through my quiet kitchen. But during the holidays, I was subjected to an aggressive, terrifying environment. My sister's husband, a man who uses his physical size to intimidate women, verbally attacked me and threw me out into the freezing cold because I tried to comfort my crying nephew. My sister stood by and watched. I have spent my life supporting them, and the jealousy they harbor toward my success has finally boiled over into outright hostility. She did not mention the slap. She did not mention the red welt. She painted herself as a terrified benefactor who had barely escaped a domestic nightmare. Within 48 hours, the digital mob arrived at my doorstep. Strangers found my online profile. They flooded my wedding photos with venomous comments. They called Elias a fragile, insecure tyrant. Worse, they found the public directory for the elementary school where I taught. The school's administrative inbox was inundated with emails demanding my immediate termination, claiming I was psychologically unstable and a danger to children. I sat in the principal's office. A woman named Mrs. Gable, who had known me for 6 years, and handed her my phone, showing her the photograph I had taken of Leo's bruised thigh on Thanksgiving night. Mrs. Gable looked at the photo, looked at me, and quietly promised to route all public inquiries to the district legal team. Keep your head down. Maya, she advised gently. The internet has a short memory, but my family did not. The following Tuesday, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find my mother standing on the porch. She did not look at me. She was staring at her manicured hands, nervously twisting the diamond tennis bracelet Vanessa had purchased for her previous birthday. I stepped outside, pulling the door partially shut behind me so she could not see Leo playing on the living room rug. What do you want? Helen? I asked. I had stopped calling her mom somewhere between Thursday night and Tuesday morning. She flinched. Vanessa's management team called us. 2 of her cosmetic sponsors are threatening to pause their campaigns because of the controversy. The engagement metrics are unstable. I do not care about her metrics. I said, my voice shaking with a rage, so profound it tasted like copper in my mouth. My mother finally looked at me, her eyes pleading and terrified. Maya, please, you have to issue a statement, just a short video. Say it was a misunderstanding. Say Elias overreacted because he works long shifts and was stressed. If she loses these contracts, she cannot cover the maintenance fees on the condo. Your father and I will have to sell the property. The cold winter air seemed to stop moving. The universe narrowed down to this single, devastating admission. You want me to lie? I whispered, stepping closer to her. You want me to publicly humiliate my husband and defend the woman who assaulted my infant son, so you do not have to move out of your apartment. She is your sister. My mother cried out. A defensive, ugly sound We are your family. You are supposed to protect us. You never protected me. I replied, my voice dropping to a dead, flat whisper. Do not ever come to this house again. I went back inside, locked the door, and sank against the wood. I realized then that silence would not save me. Ignoring the fire would only allow it to burn my house to the ground. The next morning, I drove 2 hours north to a climate-controlled storage facility when my Aunt Clara, my father's older sister, passed away 3 years prior. She had left her modest estate to me. Clara was a retired surgical nurse. A woman who lived alone, spoke the unvarnished truth, and was systematically ostracized by my parents because she refused to worship at the altar of Vanessa. Clara had left me a single, heavy brass key attached to a tag with a unit number. I had paid the rental fee faithfully, assuming it held antique furniture and old photo albums. Waiting for a time when I had the emotional bandwidth to sort through her belongings, I rolled up the corrugated metal door. The unit smelled of cedar and old paper. In the center of the concrete floor sat a heavy, dark oak steamer trunk. I used the brass key to unlock the rusted clasp. Inside, I did not find old dresses or nostalgic trinkets. I found manila folders, dozens of them, arranged chronologically, dating back nearly 30 years. I sat on the cold concrete floor and pulled out the first folder labeled 1994. Inside was a handwritten letter from a former neighbor, a Mrs. Gableton. It detailed how she had looked out her kitchen window and witnessed a 7-year-old Vanessa intentionally locking a neighborhood stray dog inside a metal gardening shed on a day when the temperature reached 95 degrees. Mrs. Gableton had called my parents. Attached to the letter was a carbon copy of a bank withdrawal slip from my father's account for $500, given to the neighbor to replace her damaged fence and ensure she did not call animal control. My hands began to tremble. I reached for a folder labeled 2002. It contained an emergency room intake form from Mercy Hospital. The patient was my cousin, Sarah, who was 11 at the time. The diagnosis was a fractured clavicle. Clipped to the medical form was a journal entry in Aunt Clara's precise nurse's handwriting. Helen told the attending physician, Sarah slipped on wet grass. I watched Vanessa push her backward off the trampoline because Sarah refused to give up her turn. Helen threatened to cut Sarah's parents off financially if they contradicted the story. I sat in the dim light of the storage unit for 6 hours, reading through decades of concealed violence, terminations from private schools quietly scrubbed from records, hush money paid to roommates in college who suffered mysterious, severe property damage, settlement agreements drafted by local attorneys. My parents had not just enabled a spoiled child, they had actively financed and managed a cover-up for a dangerously unstable individual because admitting the truth would require them to take responsibility. I packed the folders into a plastic bin, loaded them into the trunk of my car, and drove home. Elias and I sat at the dining room table long after Leo had gone to sleep. We spread the documents out beneath the warm glow of the chandelier. Elias read through the medical records. His jaw clenching so hard I could hear the grinding of his teeth. We are not fighting this on social media. Elias said, looking up from a settlement agreement, if you post this online, her management team will bury it. They will call it forged. They will sue you for defamation to drain our savings. Then what do we do? I asked, feeling the overwhelming weight of 30 years of secrets pressing down on my chest. We take it to someone whose entire career is built on verifying the truth. I spent 3 days researching. I found an independent investigative podcaster named Marcus Vance. He ran a highly respected ad-free journalism series that systematically dismantled fraudulent online personalities and exposed exploitative influencer management agencies. He did not care about internet drama. He cared about legally verified documentation. I sent him an encrypted email with 3 scanned documents from Aunt Clara's trunk and a single sentence. I have 30 years of financial and medical records proving a major wellness influencer has a history of violent assault, funded by her family. Marcus replied within 20 minutes. Over the next 3 weeks, Elias and I worked entirely in secret. Marcus flew out to our city. He sat in our living room with a portable scanner, authenticating every hospital record, verifying the bank routing numbers on the hush money checks, and tracking down the original witnesses. He interviewed cousin Sarah, now a 33-year-old architect, who openly wept on microphone as she recounted the trampoline incident and the terrifying threats my mother had made to keep her silent. He tracked down former college roommates who confirmed the property damage. He interviewed Mrs. Gableton's daughter, who still possessed the original carbon copy of the check my father had written. While we were building an ironclad fortress of fact, Vanessa was unraveling in the absence of my response. My silence infuriated her. She needed an antagonist to maintain her victim narrative. She announced a massive, highly promoted live stream event labeled Standing in My Truth, a conversation on family trauma. She hyped it across every platform for a week. She promised to reveal the dark reality of narcissistic siblings and promised her community a profound healing revelation. Marcus decided to release his investigative episode exactly 12 hours before Vanessa's live stream went active. He titled the 2-hour documentary, The Architecture of a Lie. The episode was clinical or sensationnel and utterly devastating. Marcus did not offer opinions. He simply laid out the timeline, played the verified audio interviews with the victims, and published the financial receipts showing my parents' systematic bribery. He ended the episode with a calm, factual recounting of Thanksgiving night, utilizing a verified photograph of Leo's bruised leg by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In the podcast had been downloaded 600,000 times. Elias and I did not watch the internet burn. We took Leo to the community park. We pushed him on the swings. We watched the winter clouds move across the sky. I left my phone locked in the glove compartment of the car. When we finally returned home and Elias placed his phone on the kitchen counter, the screen was a continuous cascade of breaking news alerts and text messages. Vanessa's carefully constructed universe had entirely collapsed. Major cosmetics brands released public statements severing all ties within hours of the podcast's release. Her talent agency formally dropped her from their roster. The narrative had violently flipped. She was no longer the brave survivor of a toxic sister, but a documented systemic abuser. Yet, Vanessa's arrogance was a terminal disease. Instead of listening to whatever crisis management team she had left, she decided to proceed with her scheduled live stream at 8 o'clock that evening. Evius and I sat on the sofa, a laptop open on the coffee table, watching in profound silence. The broadcast began. Vanessa sat in her luxurious home office, surrounded by expensive plants and soft lighting, but she looked feral. Her hair was slightly unkempt. Her eyes were rimmed in red. The viewer count skyrocketed past 200,000, but the chat window was not filled with supportive hearts and validating comments. It was a torrential flood of accusations, demands for accountability, and people quoting Marcus's podcast. Vanessa tried to speak over the digital noise. Everything you are hearing today is a criminal attack on my livelihood. She began, her voice shaking violently. My sister stole forged documents from a mentally declining aunt. My cousin is a known pathological liar who is desperate for a payout. The chat moved so fast, it blurred into a gray waterfall. She has the bank receipts. Vanessa, explain the hospital records. Why did you hit a baby? Vanessa leaned closer to the camera. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. The curated, mindful guru mask began to melt under the heat of 200,000 interrogators. You people know nothing, she screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, unrecognizable pitch. You sit in your miserable, pathetic little lives and judge me. I built an empire. I bought my parents their home. I pay for everything. Maya is nothing but a glorified babysitter who married a civil servant. She is nothing. Elias reached forward and squeezed my hand. On the screen, Vanessa picked up a heavy crystal paperweight from her desk and hurled it off camera. We heard the shattering of glass. She looked back at the lens, her chest heaving, mascara running into the fine lines around her eyes. I am the victim here. She shrieked, slamming her palms flat against the desk. I am always the victim. Can someone just silence these people? Make them shut up. Just make them shut up. It was the exact phrase, the exact tone, the exact terrifying entitlement she had displayed on Thanksgiving night. She reached forward and violently swiped at the camera, cutting the feed. The screen went black. The silence in our living room was profound. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of my parents' dining table. It was the clean, clear silence of a storm that had finally passed, leaving the air washed and bright. It is done, Elias said quietly, closing the laptop. The consequences arrived with the swift, merciless efficiency of gravity. Without her sponsorships, her ad revenue, and her agency backing, Vanessa could not sustain her lifestyle. She was forced to quietly list her city townhouse for sale within the month. More significantly, she stopped making the mortgage payments on my parents' waterfront condo. My father called me 3 weeks later. I let it go to voicemail. I sat at the kitchen island, listening to the recorded audio echo through the speaker. Maya, it is your father. His voice sounded thin, frail, and entirely stripped of its former authority. We are in a very difficult financial position. The bank is discussing foreclosure. Vanessa will not return our calls. We need to talk to you and Elias about a short-term loan. Please, Maya, we are a family. I deleted the voicemail. I did not block his number. I simply assigned it a silent ringtone, allowing their desperation to echo into an empty void. They had made their investment 30 years ago, prioritizing the golden child over their own morality, and now they were receiving their dividends. We changed the locks on our doors. We installed a new security system. I changed my legal surname on all public school directories to ensure they could not track my professional movements. Months passed. The internet moved on to new scandals and new controversies, leaving Vanessa's ruined digital footprint behind like a rusted monument to vanity. In September, Leo turned 1 year old. We did not host a massive, aesthetically pleasing event. There were no ring lights, no sponsored catering, and no performing for an audience. We held a small barbecue in our backyard. The afternoon sun filtered through the turning leaves of the oak tree. The air smelled of wood smoke and grilled corn. The guest list was small, consisting entirely of people who had earned the right to stand in our orbit. Mrs. Gable, my principal, brought a stack of board books. Elias's entire crew from the firehouse arrived, filling the yard with loud, booming laughter and genuine warmth. Cousin Sarah flew in from the city, sitting on a picnic blanket and teaching Leo how to stack wooden blocks. I stood on the back porch, holding a paper cup of cider, watching my son wobble across the grass on his unsteady legs. He laughed. A deep, resonant sound of pure joy as Elias caught him before he could tumble. I felt a profound, overwhelming lightness in my chest. For 30 years, I believed that enduring the pain of my family was the rent I had to pay to be loved. I believed that holding my tongue was a virtue. I believed that setting a boundary would destroy my world. I was right. Setting a boundary did destroy my world. It destroyed the suffocating basement I had lived in. It burned down the lies. It dismantled the heavy machinery of guilt and obligation. And when the smoke finally cleared, I was standing in the open air, holding my son, surrounded by a family we had built with our own hands. Elias walked over to the porch, hoisting Leo onto his broad shoulders. The baby clutched Elias's hair, grinning down at me with 2 tiny teeth. Elias bumped his shoulder against mine. "You all right?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. I looked at the people laughing in my backyard. I looked at the man who had stood up in a silent room and stopped a 30-year cycle of abuse with a single command. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," I said, and for the first time in my entire life, it was the absolute truth.